Good afternoon. Welcome to the Forum of the Institute of Politics. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute. I'm not going to do a long introduction because the Secretary has only about an hour, and we want to use every minute of it. Suffice to say that the last time he was here, he was running for President of the United States in this room, and Marvin Kalb, who was back there somewhere, was interviewing him as part of our effort to interview all of the candidates who were running in the primaries. He's here today to speak primarily to the new class of members of Congress who are here at the Kennedy School going through 5 or 6 days of issue briefings in preparation for assuming their responsibilities in the House. Jack Kemp served in the House for 18 years, representing an area that he represented with a helmet on for some time, the Buffalo, New York area, where for 13 years, as you all know, he was a professional football quarterback. I was mayor of Seattle, and when we see the Secretary of HUD, we always think of this is the president for the mayors. This is the person who runs the agency that deals with housing and community development in the cities. When I see Jack Kemp, though, and this has nothing to do with Republicans and HUD and not doing as much in the cities, which Jack Kemp is trying to remedy these days, I might add. But when I look at him, I see his son, Jeff, who's a quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks, who I learned today makes $400,000 for putting his finger on a football while some other guy kicks it through the goals. I'd like to introduce to you a person whose son has a better deal.
If we weren't on C-SPAN, I would say he makes more money sleeping the night before the game than I made playing it on Sunday. But it's all on C-SPAN, and I can't tell you that he's only half as good as his old man. Very proud of my children from Seattle to Wake Forest quarterback, redshirt quarterback, and 2 beautiful daughters that recently got married, and very proud to be here today, and thrilled to have an opportunity to participate in one of the most important forums in the whole country. I appreciate, Charles, the invitation, appreciate the hospitality, and also that sitting ovation for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. I was going to use my George McGovern line. One time I was at Vanderbilt University debating George McGovern after he had run in '72 and then lost in noble fashion. And he said that he always wanted to run for president in the worst way, and he did. He said it. I was going to use that line, but knowing again that we're on television, see, I can't exaggerate when we've got that liberating television camera. I'm thrilled to be here. I think this issue is one that really is a bridge between the parties. It's a bridge among races. It should be a bridge between the different philosophies, because there is one, to use a modern and controversial word, paradigm. I always thought it was something opposite of a nickel defense, but it turns out to be a model. But there's only one paradigm, and was laid down in July of 1776, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with those rights enumerated in the Declaration: life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Oh, I'm sorry, happiness. You see, in 1776, the idea of happiness or pursuing happiness was inextricably linked in the mind of the founders with access to property, access to something around which people could be empowered, not just the vote, not just equal rights, not just equal opportunity, but the chance to own something, the chance to have something of value that could be part of their own life, something they could pass on through their family to their children, that they could make a contribution to. It was at the predicate of Mr. Lincoln's model, if you will. In 1862, the Congress passed excuse the expression, a Republican idea, but it was really an American idea. The idea that we could develop the West if people could get free land. Mr. Lincoln said he wanted every poor man. If he were alive today, he would say, I want every poor man and woman. No good politician worth his or her salt would forget to bring men and women together. But he said, I want every poor man to own his own home. And the Homesteading Bill gave 160 acres of free Western land to anyone who would do two things. There was something involved in it. One, you had to occupy it. And number two, you had to improve it. Well, we really didn't need to tell people to improve their land. It's as natural as anything there is on this earth to want to improve one's own lot in life, be it physical or spiritual. And clearly, the Homesteading Act of 1862 has led to a rather bold initiative, and I say that as a conservative, a bleeding heart conservative, as opposed to an 18th century laissez-faire social Darwinist. I said Darwin, not Darman. That we don't live in a libertarian society. We live in a society in which our acts have profound importance to our neighbor. And we're taught here on the eve of holy day to both Jew and Christian. Hanukkah starts tonight. Christmas is soon. We are taught both in all the great religions that we have an obligation to our neighbor, whether our neighbor lives across the street, across the town, across the country. And being an American, particularly in what President Bush called the Revolution of 1989, we have an obligation to try to bring liberal democratic values, small l, small d, to the rest of the world. That Pax Americana is more of an idea than territory. That Pax Americana in a unipolar post-Cold War world means that we will help foster democratic values throughout the world, that the world will truly never be free until nations all over the world, you see, have those universal human rights, from Soweto, South Africa, also to the South Bronx, or from Watts to Warsaw. You say, well, why would the HUD Secretary talk about Warsaw or Soweto or Tiananmen Square, Beijing, or Managua and Moscow in the same frame of reference? Because frankly, what we have in America is not two nations. Mario Cuomo asked the rhetorical question of the 1984 Democratic Convention about one rich America, one poor America, one upper class, one underclass, one city on a hill, one city under a hill, and almost immutable, almost static. That isn't what is the problem, insofar as I have traveled our nation's inner cities for 2 years, and with all due respect to Governor Cuomo, what I see in America is two economies. What we have, in effect, is an economy in the macro sense that is driven by incentives and rewards for productive human behavior, education, family, children, working, saving, investing, taking an entrepreneurial risk. Basically, in generic fashion, those things pay off. I don't mean just in physical, but in metaphysical, and not just material, but spiritual ways. Having a family has psychic and spiritual and emotional payoff that is much more important than whether one's son plays pro football or is a mezzo-soprano or a master carpenter. You just want your children. You want to live in a country in which Dr. King's dream is truly relevant to our life, that we are judged by the merit of our character, not by the color of our skin. We're judged by our ability to produce something of value rather than just the creature comforts of having cars in the garage and piling up riches on high, so we all, when we go to our grave, have, are measured in terms of gold chains or how many BMWs or Ford what do they make today? I'd better be careful here. You see, but there's another economy. There's another economy in America. There's an economy in the pocket of poverty. I'm going to say inner city economy, but it's also relevant to rural America. It is almost like a third world socialist economy. And I'm not criticizing the people. I'm criticizing the government for allowing this to happen. In effect, there's very little private property. It's mostly public housing. Lest you think I'm speaking critically of the residents of public housing, I'm not. I am their champion. They are my hero. They are the wind beneath my wings. They are the women and men and people. I'm not just the president of the mayors, and I'm certainly not the president of these people, but I am their advocate, because I now realize after 2 years, someone from the Boston Globe just asked me, have I learned anything that has shaped my thinking after 2 years in the Bush administration traveling the nation's inner cities? And I have very much indeed, that there's tremendous talent. There's tremendous potential. There are wonderful people. There is incredible resource just waiting to be tapped all over America. And we're missing out on some of the fantastic talent that this country has to offer to itself and to the world by keeping people enmeshed in a trap. And frankly, it is a trap. It is a trap. The property is not private, it's public. The reward for work is less than the reward for welfare and being unemployed. The reward for consumption is less than the reward for saving. The reward for taking a risk in the entrepreneurial economy is less than the reward for going into the underground economy. We smother the entrepreneurial spirit, and we literally allow to be rewarded what Sharon Pratt Dixon in D.C. called the illicit capitalism. What we've done is disincentivize, I don't know if that's a very good use of the English language, and here I am at Harvard, the only PE major in the history of Occidental College ever to be invited to this prestigious forum. What we have done is smother the opportunity for men and women and families and enterprise to flourish in the above ground economy, and we've really pushed it underground. Now there's a lot worse, and it's a stain on the country. It is Dickens-like, Tale of Two Cities. It's the best of times in terms of the opportunities to make a contribution to the global search for freedom, but it's the worst of times if you're homeless. It's the worst of times if drugs have overtaken your life or your children's life, or despair is turned into alcoholism, or if you're unemployed and you want to put bread on the table for your family, or you want your daughter. I've been trying to use a metaphor for this, and I found it in a story in the Wall Street Journal, and then I want to give you a couple of radical solutions and then open it up for your questions. The metaphor that I've been using is, or was captured from me in an article in the Wall Street Journal a number of weeks ago, where a young Chicano woman with a daughter 5 years old living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was hauled by a social welfare worker who I'm sure had the noble goal of preventing fraud in our welfare system at heart. But what she did is she took a young Chicano woman who had lived here for 3 or 4 years, who had a 5-year-old daughter, and this mother had what every mother in the world has. She had the desire for her daughter to get a better chance in life than she had. And she began to save her pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, dollars, and she got up to $3,000. And something happened when she got to $3,000. She violated the Afdc asset limit, which says you can't have more than $1,000 in the bank at any one time in assets. They accused her of fraud, took her to court, and according to the story, she was fined $15,000 for saving $3,000 and sentenced to a year in jail, suspended, out of the munificence of the judge's heart. And since she didn't have $15,000 to contribute to the fine, they took the $3,000. I want to ask you a question. Is there anybody in the room who faces a 100% tax at the margin on his or her savings account? No hands are up. But we do it to welfare mothers. We do it to fathers who are unemployed. Because as soon as they get that first job at McDonald's Hamburger or at McDonnell Douglas or whichever company that you can pick, on the first 4, 5, 6 rungs of the ladder, the government radically takes down their welfare, and then the payroll tax cranks in. And in Los Angeles County, where the studies were done, and in St. Louis by St. Louis University, one of the most recent studies says for every dollar of income earned in the economy and the private sector, $1.50 is lost in combined tax as well as welfare transfer payment loss, which is not taxed. Someone figured out the other day in Washington, D.C., on my staff, that the marginal tax rate on an unemployed father or a mother on welfare with 2 children or 3 children in the District of Columbia is in the 120 to 30% marginal income tax rate. In other words, at the margin, every additional dollar earned loses 45 to 50 cents of purchasing power. When I got to HUD, I found out that if a woman in public housing were to get married, the government automatically assumed that there were 2 earners, and her rent jumped, at least in New York, from $60 a month to $600 a month. I talked earlier about modification of behavior, that you can modify behavior by altering rewards. That in a society that believes that there should be a reward for productive human effort, we have a macro economy driven substantially by rewards. Not just physical, but spiritual, and not just material, but psychic and metaphysical. There's something about working. There's something about ownership. There's something. In fact, Elena Bonner said it, the wife of the great Nobel Prize-winning physicist Andrei Sakharov. When Elena Bonner was in New York, someone said, "Mrs. Bonner, Mrs. Sakharov, what do you think the people of the world want?" She said, "The people of the world don't want war. They want to own a house." Wow, what a radical idea. That's what Grace Capetillo wants for her daughter Michelle, a chance to own a house, a chance to get a job. She's told the Wall Street Journal she wants to take a job. She wants her daughter Michelle to go to college. You know, that's what my mama wanted for me, and that's what I want for our children, or they had the opportunity to do. We want that for our grandchildren. I'm not telling you anything. All I'm doing, I guess, is a priori recognizing that the system, though, is turned upside down when it comes to the lives of low-income people. Now, on the left, we have the elitist who says, well, they're poor. They're going to be perpetually poor. The marketplace would never work for them. Ergo, we will anesthetize them from the free enterprise system and the private property-based system and the entrepreneurial capitalistic system. We'll just anesthetize them from the vicissitudes and the vagaries and the competition of the marketplace by making sure that they never slip below a level of income and that they are relatively secure in welfare, relatively secure in their poverty. But it's an impoverishing idea to treat people that way. But on the right, we have the libertarian who says, hey, I pick myself up by my boots, why can't they? Whoever they are. And they is always someone other than them or Cousin Willie. It's always somebody else. And I am convinced that it's very difficult, first of all, to pick yourself up by the boots when you have no boots. And that the government of the United States has a moral as well as a political responsibility to make sure in as affluent society as we have that there is a level of income under which people should not be allowed to fall. I would agree to a large part with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's thesis that there should be either some form of a negative income tax or some form of assuring that there will be a level of income to a family below which they would not be allowed to fall. However, that we also do a lot better job of building a ladder out of poverty upon which people can climb that digs deeper, not rises higher. Because the ladder goes pretty high, with all due respect. The trouble is, it doesn't dig deep enough. There aren't enough jobs in the inner city. There aren't enough educational opportunities that will pay off in a job. The reward for the less productive human activities that we can just pick randomly is far greater than the reward for those things that we know leads to success. And you say, well, Kemp, you've talked now for 10 minutes and you haven't told us what the answers are. Here they come. Now, I got to apologize for all people who think the HUD Secretary should only talk about housing, because, frankly, you can't talk about housing and not talk about jobs. How can you talk about housing and not give people the opportunity to get a stream of income and a savings account and a wage source that will allow them to be consumers in the marketplace to afford to buy housing, notwithstanding what governments do at all levels of government to prevent affordable housing going into low and moderate income communities, and then what some neighbors do by that syndrome called NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard. I won't talk about that today unless it comes up, but I will say there are several things that can be done. Number one, we have to radically alter the tax system. There should be no tax on the first 4, 5, 6 rungs of the ladder, so that when some father who's unemployed, a mother on welfare, gets that first job, the reward is dramatically higher for working than for not working. I mean, that just is a priori self-evident. But secondly, there has to be a stronger incentive in those areas, in those pockets, that would bring entrepreneurs together with the job seekers. Now, I don't know if you can find a better word, but I love the word entrepreneur. I'm not talking now about the real estate magnate who, manipulates paper and builds a huge estate, but only by functioning around the edges of the debt equity system. I'm talking about the guy or the gal who's got an idea. And it's not for you to judge whether it is to be successful. David Birch at MIT says that 97% of all the new businesses probably fail once or twice in the first few years. You cannot pick winners and losers. You've got to have a climate in which any man, any woman of any color, any background gets an opportunity to try out their version of the American dream on who? The consumer. The consumer. They're the king. They should be. They're the ones that choose whether or not through the discipline of the marketplace he or she makes a profit. But I'll tell you what I do. And what we've been trying for 10 years, I'm getting so tired of talking about it. I told the Democratic and freshman Republicans, if they let Mayor Gabriel Popov of Moscow, Russia, have an enterprise zone in downtown Moscow before I get one for downtown Harlem or East St. Louis, or we get one in Eastern Europe before we get one in East St. Louis or East Harlem or East L.A. or East Palo Alto. I just don't want to be the housing secretary if somebody doesn't do something in those red-lined areas of the inner city to change the red line from despair to a green line rewarding success. There ought to be no. Now, I know you've heard a debate in this country about whether or not we should take President Bush's idea of cutting capital gains tax rate to 15. Set aside your emotional attachment to taxing the rich for 1 minute and consider the fact. By the way, let me let you in on a secret. Rich people don't give a darn about the capital gain tax. They're already rich. The capital gain tax in America is a tax on poor folks who want to get rich. It's not a tax on wealth. It's a tax on creating wealth. It's not, you don't do it for the rich, do it for the poor. Do it for Massachusetts. The revenue base of the state of Massachusetts and New York and Connecticut and New Jersey and California and every other state in the union is dramatically going down in terms of revenues and rising in terms of social expenditures or social welfare expenditures because of the lost jobs and the lost revenues that businesses, particularly small businesses, add to the tax base. Put that aside, though, because I know that you're all emotionally attached to the idea that George Mitchell was right when he said, and Bill Bradley, my dear friend, he said it was his proudest moment, the U.S. Congress, to prevent President Bush from getting a 15% capital gains rate. Put aside that for just a moment, if you can, after I've beat it to death. What would you think what would you think about finding an area that's redlined? Now, you know what a red line is. It's an area in which there was a political decision not to invest, not to lend, not to put any seed corn, not to put any, can I mention it here at Harvard? Capital. Capital. And if that bothers you, I'll use seed corn. I'm not a wise guy. I just, it loosens me up to remember that we all have a big stake in making it work. But it's not working for poor folks. So I would eliminate it. I would say, if you could find an area, I could find some areas. Let me name some, just to give you a sense of what I'm thinking about. South Bronx, East Harlem, Liberty City, Miami, Overtown, Motown, East LA, East St. Louis, East Palo Alto, downtown Buffalo, right here in Boston. What would you say if the federal government, like Tom Kean did in New Jersey, Governor Kean, when he was governor, eliminated the capital gain tax on any man, any woman of any color that would invest in an enterprise that hired people off the welfare and unemployment rolls and gave them an opportunity to earn wages? And then the government said, we want the woman or the man who takes the job to also get a labor-based incentive. You got a capital-based incentive. We need a labor-based incentive. No payroll tax or an earned income tax credit or a refundable tax credit, so that when the first 4, 5, 6 rungs of the ladder are reached by that woman or that man on that ladder, no tax on his or her income up to 190% of the poverty. And then someone would say, as Jesse Jackson does, when I first heard him say this, when he and I were the speakers at Earl Graves' Black Magazine Inc., Black Enterprise Inc., Jesse Jackson said, capitalism without capital is nothing but an ism. I did what you're doing. I laughed. I said, that guy can come up with more phrase. You know what? Very wise statement. You see, we got capitalism, but there's not enough capital. There's certainly not enough of capital in the black and the minority enterprising men and women in this country. At the moment in which minorities are getting an opportunity to reach for that ladder is the exact moment we have put in a tax code in this country that punishes the reward for forming capital and injecting it into the new startup entrepreneurial sector of the economy. Black Americans, I'm looking at Asian and Latino and Hispanic and all sorts of Americans. I'm just picking this not to say that this is the only concern, but all minorities. But blacks represent 12% of the population, own less than 0.5% of the total capital stock of America. America's $30 trillion of capital. Blacks own less than 0.5%. What's the answer? Charlie Rangel came up with a good idea. Eliminate the tax or expense the investment by any investor, any venture capitalist who puts money into the equity or the debenture or the stock of an enterprise-owned enterprise can write off his or her investment in the year in which they make the investment. In order to drive capital into high-risk businesses, be they enterprise-owned or minority. Take public housing and tie the enterprise zone to the public housing community. I won't go into detail, but you cannot find a public housing community in America in which they're pound for pound and inch for inch as much entrepreneurship as you will find in any suburban level of America. But the trouble is, it is absolutely smothered by a regulatory and a concept that there is nothing there, so keep people perpetually. And I frankly think it is racist, but it is certainly elitist, and I won't choose to debate the racist side of it, but it's elitist. It's the attitude, I went into it before. We should say anybody who wants to homestead in the urban areas of America, any HUD-assisted house, any public-owned house through the PHAs, the public housing authorities, should have an opportunity to buy it from the public housing authority. We did it at Kenilworth Parkside in East Washington, D.C. The young black woman, African-American woman, Kimmy Gray, now owns her own home. So does the other 400 residents. And 2 years ago, they were all living in public housing. They started a program called College Here We Come. And with our help, our subsidies, and I don't mean that in the sense that I did anything that we shouldn't have been doing. We did it the right way. They now own it. They sold it to them for $1. $1. Now, we spent a lot of money rehabbing the units because you can't let people live with lead-based paint dust around, which infects the children, and you can't leave them living in a hovel. So we used our source of federal subsidy to rehabilitate the stock and then sold it to the residents, and then they performed the sweat equity to help reform, manage, control, and today they're homeowners. One of my favorite stories is a woman in Syracuse who got her first home. She said, when asked by the press how Kemp could be so optimistic about how her house would look 15 years from today, she said, she said to the press, well, for the first time in my life, I have something of value to pass on to my children. Does anybody doubt that if somebody owns something and has something they can leave to their family, leave to their children, put into their estate, they treat it differently? It has nothing to do with color. It has to do with the universal spirit alluded to by Yelena Bonner. It was part of Dr. King's dream, Mr. Lincoln's dream, and it goes far beyond Thomas Jefferson. The bill that we just passed in the Bush administration, and with the help of a lot of Democrats and a lot of conservatives and a lot of liberals, I don't want to ruin your day about how partisan Democrats can work with partisan Republicans to get something done. We passed a bill called the National Affordable Housing Act, but it introduced a radical concept. Dare I use the word empowerment? It empowers the people directly as opposed to empowering the developer. It takes the subsidies and treats the people as consumers as opposed to treating them as wards of the state and subject to the social welfare bureaucracy. It took the grants and turned them from the lawyers and the consultants over to the people, and in that partnership they now can have a chance to own. And we pledged, President Bush and I, that we'd create, and I don't mean we'd create, but we'd create a system in which there could be 1 million new homeowners among the ranks of low and moderate income people by 1992. I asked my staff how far we are on that, and there's 275,000. We will reach it by far. We'll far exceed it by 1992. It takes block grant money from the federal government and turns them back to the states in public-private partnerships so the states can be incentivized to form through vouchers and rehabbing, both light and mod, as well as construction where the market dictates. They will have $3 billion of grant money unencumbered but incentivized. Mayor, former mayor. In fact, the rehabbing and the vouchers come first, and construction where the market dictates. It also, for the first time, takes our CAP money, our public housing modernization money, and authorizes $2 billion for the cleanup of public housing. Plus, it can be used to help fight drugs and things like that. One last point I want to make about the bill. For the first time, the $1 billion of homeless monies that have been, I'm not going to say wasted, because they're not wasted. But for the first time, we're going to take transitional housing needs and tie together the support services so that job training, daycare, help to a person or a family who might have an alcohol dependency or a chemical dependency or a mental health problem or a loss of a skill. It's going to tie the shelter and transitional housing to the type of supportive services, both for the homeless and the frail elderly, that can help create independence, not dependence. I guess I want to stop on that thought. It's easy to make people dependent, but it's a lot easier to make people independent. But in making people independent, you cannot take the attitude, I did it for you. You see, that's the trouble. All too many people want someone to get down their hands and knees and say, oh, thank you, Mr. Government. Or thank you, Mr. HUD. Or thank you, Mr. Congressman or woman. Thank you for doing this for us. You see, the problem, we had to turn the thinking of the political class away from doing something for somebody that makes them dependent on politics or politicians and makes them instead independent. Gives them the opportunity to form the skills and the independent life that then they could say, hey, I'm somebody. Not to aggrandize oneself, but to ultimately make sure that our democracy flourishes. Because I don't think we can, in the last century, we couldn't exist half slave, half free. Lincoln's divided house speech was a magnificent reminder that America was to be universal dream, that we were not just writing those words down for white folk, or middle-class folk, or Caucasians, or North Americans. We were writing it for all time and for all people, and that someday it's got to touch the lives of everybody in the world. And if that sounds kind of radical or democratic, so be it. It's either that or say, come home, America. We have no business being anywhere else. We have no responsibilities other than I got mine, Jack. And I think that's the opposite of what this season into which we are entering tonight teaches. And I look forward to answering your questions. Appreciate the fair hearing you're giving me. Thank you very much.
What, about 5 minutes?
No, yeah, I'll go right to 5.
Right to 5. Great. So let me just tell him,
Thank you.
well, we have 2 mics. We'll alternate from mic to mic, and we'll start over here, Marty, and we'll go right to 5 o'clock.
There may be some up there, so I can't see very well with the Klieg lights, but do they have to come down here? Sorry, you guys. You got to come down here.
Secretary Kemp.
Start on the left.
Well, in fact, yes, I am a liberal Democratic member of the Kennedy School community. First, I'd like to take issue with your presumption that ideologically the people in this room necessarily oppose you. As a liberal Democrat, okay. I mean, we've been watching what you've been doing with interest. But my question actually has to do with the current, the S&L banking crisis. So we heard a lot of stories about the Freedom Bank in Harlem, for example, failing and taking a lot of hopes and dreams away with it. Clearly, it's a problem. There will be dislocations. A lot of people are going to suffer. But there's also the point that in every challenge there are opportunities. And my question is, what opportunities do you at HUD, in your bailiwick in particular, see for moving the cause of people, of empowerment of people,
right,
of getting housing forward in the time of adversity? I mean, we've seen a correction in prices.
I appreciate your statement about the fact that I seemed to imply that you were the adversary. I was teasing. It was just kind of a rhetorical cheap shot. Because I'm a liberal Democrat. Small L, small d. No, I'm not being cute. Words have meaning, and the word liberal in Latin means to be free and open and generous. And this is a free and open and generous debate, and I want to approach it that way. So in that sense, I very much appreciate the question, A. Secondly, what can we do to turn this problem into an opportunity?
Challenge
Into an opportunity. My wife has a little saying on our refrigerator for the children. It says, problems are opportunities disguised often as insurmountable barriers. And that's a good way of looking. Your attitude, to a large extent, determines the outcome. Does anybody doubt that? I don't. Being an old pro football quarterback, I can't imagine a quarterback going to huddle and say, has anybody got a good play? Or... You know, Joe Montana does not walk and say, gosh, those guys are big, and I know this play. I know this has never worked before, but I think I'll throw it up in the air to Jerry Rice. Come to think of it, that's probably what he does do. Seriously, the savings and loan debacle, and if this would take the rest of the afternoon to talk about it, can be turned into an opportunity. Number one, we can recognize how important it is to use some of these funds that are going to be injected into the thrift and into the Federal Home Loan Bank system for a program of affordable housing for low and moderate income people, and we're doing that. I'm the chairman of the Federal Housing Finance Board, which was a product of FIREA, the legislation that so-called bailed out the banks. It really didn't bail out the banks as much as it bailed out the depositors. But having said that, clearly there should be an affordable housing program. We have to end redlining in America. There are many things that can be done to create the tax system to be incentivized for low and moderate income housing, both for single and multifamily housing. We did that in the recent tax bill, thanks to Democrats and Republicans. As far as I'm concerned, the federal government does have a responsibility to undertake and look at every barrier to affordable housing that exists in the country. And we've also done that, a Bush-led study that we helped organize and got mayors and governors and housing experts and sidewalk activists from Gail Sincata of Chicago to Barry Zegas. We have identified barriers to affordable housing that prevent low-income people from ever getting a chance to own their home or get a house. I won't bore you with the details, but in Los Angeles, California, probably $50,000 of the first-time the cost of a first-time home is attributable to regulations, exclusivity of zoning, building codes, and things like that. So I do think that this crisis is going to bring out the best in us, or this problem is going to bring out the best in us, and we certainly are trying to do that. And then finally, P.S., I believe that the spirit of the bipartisan approach to trying to have a healthy thrift and financial industry helped lead to the passage of the National Affordable Housing Bill with President Bush's HOPE component in there, home ownership opportunities for people everywhere. I believe housing is on the front burner now, where it wasn't for a number of years, and so I think that is all to the good. I will finally say there is a crunch on credit that is hurting both housing and real estate, and in some ways I believe that we have to do something dramatic to get regulators to recognize that there has to be equilibrium or balance between the need to prevent future S&L disasters and the ability of our financial system to recover enough to inject credit and a supply of capital into housing, real estate, developing the economy, and making loans to people to do things that otherwise they're not going to do if they are absolutely squeezed by some regulatory reign of terror. I think we're in a man-made recession. A man-made recession. It was preventable. But it is occurring right now, particularly in the Northeast, because both A, regulatory overreach, and B, the failure of the Congress, I believe, to give the president a cut in the capital gains rate back in 1988 and 89 when he campaigned on it. I know a lot of people disagree with me, but I am absolutely convinced that right now, if you bought a home for $60,000 in 1980, sold it for $100,000, most of the gain would be an appreciation in nominal value of the house. But the 28% tax on a $40,000 gain, most of which is inflation, means you could pay probably $15,000 or $16,000 tax on the profit of so-called $40,000, but you'd be paying tax on not the real appreciation of the value of the property. You'd be paying the tax on the inflated value. Therefore, we're not taxing gains, we're taxing capital. That's dumb, and we should reverse that policy. But it's not for me to say. We got to have a debate in the Congress. Thanks for your question. Yes, sir. Oh, on the right.
Yeah, not necessarily.
I'm long-winded. I apologize. I'll be a lot shorter.
Welcome, Secretary Kemp.
Thank you.
As a liberal Democrat, large L, large D.
All right.
And also, also as a resident of Detroit, Michigan, I find much wisdom in what you've said tonight. But I'm really interested in something I read in the Wall Street Journal about 4 to 5 days ago, what the new chairman of the Republican Party has indicated that the agenda will be for the 1992 presidential race, and that is quotas. You said tonight that jobs, you can't talk housing without talking jobs, and in many areas and in many disciplines you can't talk jobs unless you're talking affirmative action or quotas and so forth. He found Jesse Helms' ad that was in the Harvey Gantt race not only appropriate, but something that is that can be utilized effectively in the 1992 race.
I don't think Bill Bennett said that, but for myself, because I can only speak for myself. I don't want to speak for Lee Atwater, Bill Bennett. I can't speak for George Bush. I can tell you, sir, I would never have run that ad. I don't believe that we want an America in which we have a country divided by color, divided by class, divided by ethnicity, divided by religion. And let me say one thing other. I don't say that to get an applause. I say it from the depths of my heart, that my whole philosophy and my whole belief, and what made me go to HUD in the first place, Charles, is my belief that we can do a lot better than debate a shrinking piece of a shrinking pie. You can spend all your time talking about a quota or a system in which, like children, we play musical chairs where the big guy elbows out the little guy, or the little gal gets the chair, and there's always one less chair, and pretty soon we're all either, sprawled in the corner, and the big guy, in some Darwinian biological survival fashion, gets the last chair. That's not what America was meant to be. We want more chairs, a bigger table, a bigger pie, and the question should be between you and me is, how do we get the pie growing? How do we get the tide rising that will lift boats? And whereas Vernon Jordan said boats are sunk on the bottom of the harbor, what can we do legitimately to use government to go in and repair the boats that are hurt or hurting or in such condition that they won't rise on that tide? So we've got two things. We've got a macro responsibility to make the tide rise, i.e. economic growth. And then secondly, we have a Judeo-Christian societal responsibility to create more opportunities for people where their boats have been sunk. So I don't want to see America divided over quotas. The issue was legitimate to raise, but it would be an illegitimate solution to suggest that the Republican Party should run in 1992 as David Duke. There's no place for David Duke in the party of Lincoln. There's no place in the Republican Party of Mr. Lincoln for anybody who bases their politics on race, color, anti-Semitism, or bigotry, or ethnic prejudice. And I want to say that as clearly as I possibly can. I believe with all my heart that this country's got to find a better answer. That's why I'm such an outspoken advocate of economic growth. That's why I just quoted President John F. Kennedy over at the luncheon with the Republicans and Democrats. The Democratic platform in 1960 committed America to growing 5% per annum. I can tell you, at 2% per annum growth, we would have enough revenues in a $6 trillion economy to do two things: both reduce the deficit and spend more money for education, transportation, mental health, and all of the social and economic problems of, that all too often manifest themselves in some of these pathologies. So I want my politics in 1980, at least 1990 and 92. See, I don't even know when we're running.
Thank you for that.
A fuzzy-minded conservative.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We got to get America moving again, folks. And it doesn't have to come at the expense of the environment. It isn't bigger is better. I just came from Apple Computer. Smaller is better. It's more efficient. It's less costly. They're working on a computer that will be able to take children and turn them from inner city, ghetto, impoverished children to the talent that they represent. They're doing it in Memphis, Tennessee. Every single kid in every single inner city school in Memphis, Tennessee now has an Apple computer. I'm not making a plug for Apple, but I really remarkably expect that it won't be long before we're going to have a computer and a workstation in every school, in every home, in the inner cities of America, and then we ought to export them to Soviet Union and liberate them from...
Secretary Kemp, someone who mirrored much of what you're saying 23 years ago, 24 or 23 years ago, was Senator Robert Kennedy.
Oh, Bob Kennedy.
Who wrote a blueprint in this book, To Seek a Newer World. Much of what you're saying. In 1967, he introduced two bills, one of which would have given tax credits to any firm that would go into a ghetto area and provide at least 20 jobs. And one which would have given tax credits to firms that would build low-income housing. Lyndon Johnson's administration bottled both up in the Finance Committee because they thought it was an affront to their war on poverty.
I believe if Bobby Kennedy were around today, he'd be the strongest proponent of the enterprise zones. And the co-sponsor is Charlie Rangel of Harlem.
My question to you is this. Neither of those bills passed, but one that did was called the Special Impact Program. And that was in 1966. He and Jacob Javits got that passed. And the point of that bill was to take federal money and let it act as seed money for community development corporations, which were small, entrepreneurial, community-owned organizations in the ghettos.
That's an oxymoron. With all due respect, I'm not trying to pick on you, and finish your question.
Okay.
But it's oxymoronic to say that a political organization is entrepreneurial. It is the opposite of entrepreneurial because it has no risk when it's subsidized by the government. It has no risk. You've got to have some risk capital, and that's why I have emphasized the other approach rather than having some political body pick you, according to which political party you're in, or who's got the most muscle, or who's got the most lobbying effort. We ought to say, I'm not saying the invisible hand, but I do believe David Birch was right. The most dynamic economy is the one in which you've got the most startups and where politicians are not trying to pick the winners and the losers. Once you get the politicians, you get WedTech. Need I go further? But what's the question?
Well,
That's the answer. What's the question?
I guess that his point was that you needed seed money, startup money for these firms, and the most it was ever funded, the Special Impact Program, was a measly $20 million. And the special impact program was repealed in 1981 in the omnibus bill.
Well, what'd you think of my idea of allowing people to expense their investment in the equity, debenture, or stock of a minority enterprise that locates in an enterprise zone? Wouldn't that then say that you've got a tremendous carrot, but you're not trying to have Kemp or Bush or the Congress or anybody pick who gets the credit? It ought to be available to everybody, because when you start picking winners and losers, then the politics takes over and the distortions begin to manifest themselves. But you know what? You need to know what Bobby Kennedy said. Great quote. He said, to fight poverty without the army, to fight poverty without free enterprise is to try to fight a war without your army. I'm not talking, you can't fight poverty without free enterprise. I understand there's a role for government, but you've got to get the entrepreneurial sector challenged. And I'm not talking about corporate capitalism. I'm talking about people, popular, Main Street, entrepreneurial enterprise. And frankly, it's being squashed in America, and it's being killed in the inner cities, and we've got to use it as a tool. And we'd be stupid not to use a good tool, particularly when Eastern Europe is begging for more tools with which to fight poverty. Yes, sir. Well, that's a pretty good dialogue.
Go ahead.
Okay. Maybe I'll have better luck.
At your risk. Go ahead.
To my question.
I'm teasing. This is all.
Secretary Kemp, I agree with you that home ownership is an admirable ideal. My concern is that...
it's not an ideal.
That I'm not going to finish my question. But my concern is that the rents affordable to many of the people living in subsidized and public housing are barely enough, if enough, to cover the operations and maintenance costs of those units. If we do give these the people living in these units home ownership, and they're not able to maintain the units, then what happens? If they do sell them, we lose a unit.
I went through the idea so rapidly that I failed to say something that is very important to our model, which is that once the residents at Bromley Heath in Boston, or Kenilworth Parkside in D.C., or Cochrane Gardens in St. Louis, or Cabrini Green, Chicago, that George Will wants to blow up because he thinks it's like Pruitt-Igoe, impossible to save. There's going to be a renaissance at Cabrini Green. I promise you, if I promise anything here today, that these ideas will work at Cabrini Green and Estrada Courts in East L.A. in the barrio. But the point is, we will continue our subsidies in a post-sale of the housing for 5 years to continue the type of subsidy that will lead to the type of job training, daycare, and supportive services that can move people, not just from public housing, into some survival of the fittest climate, but we want to continue the type of voucherization and certificate and subsidy that will allow them to begin the process. And that's why it's so important to start linking the job to this idea, because you're right, it won't work if it is just privatization of housing alone. It has to be linked to more entrepreneurship. But at Kenilworth Parkside, they are starting small businesses that are beginning to lead to the type of revenue base that will give them more impact upon leading people into independence rather than dependence. So I agree there's a need, and I think the bill provides that, because for 5 years we continue the subsidy. Yes, sir.
I'm a director of a homeless shelter here in Howard Square, and have a question regarding homelessness particularly. A lot of people have stated that one of the main reasons for homelessness has been the destruction of SROs throughout the 1980s, which is hardly a government action, but it was rather a private action to take those units out of the market.
Yes, sir.
And what the government action was the slashing of the budget you control over the last 10 years from 32 billion to 7, which has also, in my view, increased the problem by a lot. The question I have is, people who make about $800, $900 a month, for whom home ownership is totally out of reach.
Right.
What are you going to do about them? How are you going to restore their living conditions which they had?
Keep the rest of the question on your mind, and let me just answer that part of it. Two things. Number one, the cut in housing has stopped. The bill authorizes that just passed $27 billion. That's a 27% increase over last year, and in 2 years it'll be a 35 or 40% at least authorized figure. We can get the Appropriation Committee to deal with the authorization. Will have a significant impact upon a positive turn in the right direction, A. And B, as I said, we're not going to be subsidizing or empowering developers as much as we're going to be empowering directly low-income families. And then thirdly, SRO is a very important program, and for the first time in the history of FHA, we, in our administration, have helped get FHA out of underwriting golf courses and real estate deals in California and Florida, with all due respect, and into the construction and the rehabbing or underwriting of construction and rehab of SRO capacity. And so for the first time, FHA will be directly involved in both construction as well as rehabbing of SRO capacity. I agree with you. It's a very important need for single men and women in the urban areas of America that have been, in many cases, gentrified to where there's less capacity today. So I feel like our tax code and our FHA monies should be used in a far more socially responsible way, as I have alluded. And I think the SRO capacity argument is going to be answered by this rather bold and audacious reform of FHA that we have undertaken in the last year.
But do you think you have the resources for that, considering that your budget used to be $32 billion?
Well, you keep saying that, but I just told you that we have reversed that decline, and it is now rising considerably in the right way. And then secondly, FHA is out of the golf course underwriting business, and we're back in the business of underwriting first-time homes for low and moderate income people. David Forsberg is here today, my regional administrator. He's been an active leader in Boston and in this region for getting us out of bad underwritings and into the type of underwriting of what I call socially responsible type programs, such as SRO capacity, that I think is a part of the answer to this homeless problem in America. Yes, sir.
Yes. The speech you made, if you would have made that speech when you were running for president, I think you would have made it. First of all, you mentioned Lincoln, and you mentioned, I'd like to mention another president that mentioned homes, was Harry Truman. And Harry Truman said to the people coming back from Europe and the Pacific, he said, everybody should have a home. And they came back and they have all this housing and stuff. Okay, over the years, we let this go on by. We had other priorities. Now, when you walk down the street, you see homeless people, and you mention, first of all, let me finish, please.
Well,
you know, I'll try not to make my questions as long as your answers.
Okay. Fair enough.
But I know Dave, and he's done a good job. I chewed him out. He came to our convention. I belong to the Mass Tennis Organization. I'm the president. And what I want to bring out is that I live in an SRO. And the reason I live in an SRO is I can't afford the rents here in Massachusetts. And I was thinking about a woman with 2 kids, and she's got to pay rent of $550 or $600 a month, and she's working 1 job. And she actually has to work 2 jobs to pay her rent and feed the kids, right? All right. I just want to know why, and I asked Dave this before, and I really got a good answer out of him, but he said there was a lot of trouble, bureaucracy in Washington, and you had 2 years now to straighten it out. And I'm wondering if the money's in the pipeline now, to get these people off the street and put them in SROs instead of they have these people that's mentally ill and they're putting them on the street.
Let me take a shot at it. Stay there.
Right,
Let me take a shot at it. Take a shot.
I got all night.
Well, I don't. I got to catch a plane.
Yeah, the Washington, yes.
Well, I'm.
That's where he works.
Yes. He's doing a pretty good job, I think.
Wow, thank you.
Much as I criticize him.
That's all right.
Oh, by the way, I was a conservative. Now I'm a liberal.
Well, you know what? In Russia, we'd both be liberals. And let me answer because I got to go. I promise. I'm not playing games with you.
That's
I
right.
have to catch a 6 o'clock plane. I hope I got to get through the tunnel and
we have another one
and have dinner tonight at the embassy of Israel with on the first night of Hanukkah. So I want to be there. But having said that, I don't disagree. I am convinced that affordable housing is not only a responsibility of this macro economy, this national economy, the federal. Our federal responsibility, but it's also a responsibility of each of us at the local level. We've got to rethink zoning, rethink building codes. Rethink. In San Diego, California, they could not build SRO capacity because the city council found that the building code was of such arcane proportions that it prevented an investor investing and making a slight profit in SRO capacity. Now, I don't know if it was the same in Seattle. Probably wasn't, Charles, under your dynamic leadership. But San Diego had to go through a 5-year period of changing the building code. We are asking every city, every state, every government entity to look at its own barriers. What are you doing at the local level through building codes, zoning laws, rent controls? What are you doing to the stock of housing that you place up as a barrier that raises the cost of housing for low and moderate income people? Interest rates are part of the problem. Taxes are part of the problem. So I think it is a healthy debate here today to get liberals and conservatives and revolutionaries and radicals and the left and the right and Democrat and Republican and all sorts of people together in this environment and say, look, America, if this country is to be what it was meant to be, we've got to make sure that there is no family in America that goes without housing, right, that no child goes without education and access to college education if for some reason they can't afford it, that there is a job for everybody. And I'm not talking about a massive type of government program. I'm talking about unleashing the capacity of this country to do a lot better than it's doing. I don't believe we should accept 1% growth per annum or a 0 growth rate. I don't think we should. I don't think we ought to accept the levels of poverty and despair and drugs and even crime in our nation's cities or pockets of poverty. But we've got to get over this idea that some people have, that somewhere in America there's somebody getting rich. I know some people who are more worried about somebody getting rich in America than they are about the level of poverty or the number of people falling into poverty. So I want to conclude my remarks with great apologies. I'll come back if ARCO will ever have me, by quoting my favorite Republican, my favorite president, my favorite human being, Abraham Lincoln, who said these words when he was accused of being for the rich in his first campaign in 1860. He said, I don't believe in laws that prevent someone from getting rich. They do more harm than good. We want a country in which the humblest, now he said man, he wanted the humblest person the equality of opportunity to get rich with everyone else. When one starts poor in life, as most of us do, he said the freest society is the one in which he knows he can better his condition. I want every man to have that chance. I want the black man to have that chance. He got assassinated for that thought. I want them to have the opportunity to better their condition, in which they can look forward to being a hired laborer. And then next year they can work for themselves, and someday they can hire others to work for them. This is the true system. Ladies and gentlemen, with all due respect to my friends on the left and some of my friends on the libertarian right, the truest system is the one that encourages people to have an opportunity to work, save, not just drive a truck, but own it, and not just own it, but own the trucking company someday. And I believe with all my heart, our democracy will not truly be as opportunistic as we want it until we've got a democracy in which there's full employment, job for everyone who wants it, needs it, and an opportunity for people to get access to property, get access to housing and home ownership. And very frankly, I think we have established a debate in America where today we're too worried about some Sam Walton who started as a clerk at J.C. Penney and is now, I guess, one of the richest men in the country. Frankly, I think Sam Walton is as much of a beneficiary to America for all the jobs and all the revenues and all of the tax base and all of the good that he's done for the country. How about John Johnson of Ebony and Jet magazine? Started with $400. Now is the richest, I guess, African-American in the United States of America. I don't care how rich John Johnson is. I want to know, are people better off for having a John Johnson on this earth who, with his mother, sold $400 of furniture in 1944 or 45? And started a publishing empire that produces Jet and Ebony, or Earl Graves of Black Enterprise. I mean, who cares? As long as they pay their taxes, as long as the revenues go up, and as long as they create jobs, I think we want a country in which any man, any woman, any child has the opportunity to be what God meant them to be. And if they're meant to be an entrepreneur or an engineer or a school teacher, as my daughter is, or a pro football quarterback, let's start tapping the greatest talent this nation has, and that's our people. They are the resource in the information age. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about how to conclude poverty.